right, welcome to another episode of On the Mic with Ed. You are here with myself, Maria Ortiz, and co-host Dr. Zoe Ross Nash. We also have an awesome guest with us today, Hannah Foll, and we are thrilled because we are going to be talking about all things binge eating. So, binge eating disorder, assessment, pathology, intervention, stigma, just so much valuable conversation happening around binge eating disorder today. So, I'm going to let Zoe share a little bit more about our guest, and then we'll let Hannah speak for herself.
Yes, we are so excited to have Hannah here today, so thank you for being here. Hannah is the owner of Mind Belly Soul Nutrition, and she uses an intuitive eating lens and is an eating disorder dietitian and just has a wealth of information of all things eating disorders, but specifically binge eating, which is so important because I feel like binge eating is the most prominent eating disorder and yet woefully understudied in research and in clinical work. So we are just so grateful for your expertise today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. So excited to dive in.
Well, why don't we ask that first question of can you describe binge eating disorder and how does it differ from just like occasional overeating?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so there's a couple of things here that I really love to look at and explore with my clients that I think can be really helpful. One thing that I do see a lot, like I really appreciate this question because so often we feel like we're binging, or we're maybe even calling it binging or naming it as binging when we're not really binging. And oftentimes this is a means to just like guilt and shame ourselves. Sometimes there is guilt and shame wrapped up in the terminology that we're using, right? Or the words that we're using in our internal talk. And so it can be really helpful to start identifying, like, is this a true binge? Is this not a true binge? And then, of course, we want to break down the guilt and shame altogether and move that away from the terminology. But so, of course, there's like the DSM criteria around like what is binge eating disorder. I love to really look at it with my clients in three criteria. So I love to break down, are we eating inarguably to excess, right? So sometimes, we might go back for seconds, we might go back for thirds. That is not eating inarguably to excess, right? Eating inarguably to excess would be, I had 15 brownies and then went back for some more and then more and then more, right? So it needs to be very like objectively in excess. There's a sense of feeling out of control around the food. Sometimes it feels like we're powerless to the food, and it's often emotionally driven. Sometimes we're not aware of the emotions that are under the surface, but I'm sure this will come up at some point. Sometimes we look at the emotional eating spectrum, and there's really two ends to the spectrum. Sometimes food just provides us some comfort, some deliciousness, some tastiness, right? And that's not a part of emotional eating that is negative in any way. And sometimes food is serving more of a numbing or even a self-harming purpose. And that's where we really want to look at it with binge eating.
Wow, that answer just triggered so many important questions. And I guess my first thought on that is how do you deal with someone who is having maybe like a subjective binge versus an objective
Mhm.
binge? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I think it can also be helpful to define what is overeating, right? There is so much around this. And we hear this in diet culture, we hear this in society as well, where it's like, oh, you have an overeating problem, or don't overeat, or watch what you're eating. Like overeating is so bad, right? So there is this feeling, this messaging of wrapping up that term in guilt and shame. And that can really range, right? We could have a totally normal meal and then our internal talk is like, oh, I overate. And it's just a way to beat ourselves up, right? So I love to support my clients in redefining what overeating means for them. I also love to support them and allowing them to define it for themselves. The definition I love to go by and love to kind of like guide my clients towards is eating past our physical, emotional, and pleasure needs, right? So food serves all these purposes beyond just our body and our physical needs. And so if our needs are met, right, our physical needs are met, our body's taken care of, our pleasure needs are met, ooh, that looked really tasty, and I feel like I'm satisfied and I've had enough, and my emotional needs are met, and I continue eating, that is where we would look at this as like, okay, this is what we can identify as overeating.
Wow, this is just like a
Yeah.
very eloquent explanations of binge eating disorder and just binge eating it as a whole. So I'm really, really glad that you're here. I love that you even said that, yeah, food serves multiple purposes in our life. And I think that sometimes in the ED space, we can even get a little bit kind of boxy of like how food shows up. So I love the flexibility there. I love the definition that you shared. We'll certainly be highlighting that quote because I think it's really, really impactful. I am curious, kind of, this is kind of the pathology that you see, the definitions that you go by. For you, what are some of like the physical or psychological signs that trigger you to go, ooh, should I assess that something's going on here?
Yeah, totally. So I feel like there's so many things, right? Um, Oftentimes in getting to know a client, looking at diet history and also just the way we're talking and thinking about food is often a really big window into our internal relationship with food. I think with binge eating disorder specifically, we think of it as this as just binging, right? As just the eating a lot, quote unquote. And there's so much more to it. And so there's actually a lot of signs that I'm looking for that have nothing to do with the binging itself, like restriction around food, relationship to emotions. Oftentimes there's weight cycling that comes up or like pursuing weight loss. Oftentimes malnutrition, being undernourished, right? Like all of those things are big criteria that are some red flag indicators that there might be something going on.
Wow, you bring up actually the potential for undernourishment or malnourishment. And I appreciate
Mhm.
you stating that because I assume some of our listeners might be confused. People really, they hear maybe anorexia nervosa and they go, ooh, malnourished, underweight. Then they hear binge eating disorder and they go, oh, overnourished, overweight. Can you explain a little bit more about why that opinion or perception is a little bit skewed or off from reality?
Yeah. Oof, big question here, right? Like it's like why does weight stigma exist in society?
So
And
answer
you
it as
are tackling
concisely.
it. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
your job to
yeah.
explain it right now.
Yeah, I mean it's hard, like it's awful, right? But it is so deeply intertwined into our society, this idea that thin bodies are better, big bodies are bad. We all need to be thin. We all should be pursuing weight loss. And so remind me of your question, like totally escaped my brain.
Kind of like how, even with binge eating disorder, how you might see an
Hmm.
actually malnourishment or like
Yeah.
undernourishment presentation, even while somebody's binging or quote unquote overeating.
Totally, totally. Yeah, so there's this misconception, right? That like binge eating equals being in a large body and restriction equals being in a small body. And that's not really the case. And regardless of that, we also can be malnourished in any body size, right? And so it's really the lack of nutrients, the inconsistency in nutrient intake affects our nutrition status, regardless of the size of our body. We're not going to necessarily see malnourishment in the size of our body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for naming that. I have clients that will come in and say, I have binge eating disorder. And then when I do a thorough assessment, there's actually significant restriction going on. And I think in society, we pathologize binging as the quote unquote bad eating disorder and anorexia as the quote unquote good eating disorder. And they're not seeing the pathology that is associated with restricting because that's what's been glorified in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with all the binge eating clients I've worked with, never have I encountered someone where restriction was not present, right? Restriction is pretty much always present. I don't want to say always. Maybe there's someone out there that I don't know, right? But it is pretty much always present with binge eating disorder.
And I think we have to remember too that mental restriction counts. So if people are beating
Mm-hmm.
themselves up after they eat, if they are feeling that immense guilt and shame, oh, I shouldn't have had that. I'll make sure that I skip breakfast tomorrow. Those things matter, and our brain perceives it as restriction. And I usually hear the language of like if we're binging somewhere, like we're restricting somewhere as well. And I think Zoe's absolutely right that society has almost named like, oh, restrictive behaviors as better than binging behaviors. Nope, it's an eating disorder pathology and behavior, regardless of which one it is. Neither one is better, but society loves to glamorize the restrictive ones. Unfortunately, I've even heard some binge eating clients come in um, and stating that providers have actually recommended restrictive behaviors to combat their binge eating or quote unquote overeating. And that's absolutely
Hmm.
terrifying. They will give restrictive recommendations that maybe my restrictive clients actually struggle with as quote unquote better than what they have.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's so sad. I hear this all the time as well. I think we see this in like healthcare at the doctor's office, people who are really misinformed about what the underlying causes of an eating disorder are and what's really driving the eating disorder, right? And so those recommendations are so harmful and just continue to drive the root cause of all of it.
I use that term, when I'm assessing for clients. Would you mind explaining how you assess for binge eating with your clients who come into treatment? And what key information or tools do you look out for and use?
Yeah, totally. Okay, love this question. So there's so many things. Like there's all the clinical assessment things, of course, right? Like we're going to look at your mental health history. We're going to look at your medical history. We're going to look at your GI stuff. Are there any GI symptoms going on? But also like your social world, your personal life, right? Who do you live with? What kind of things do you like to do for fun? And then there's some things, there's some big areas. I actually love to talk about our relationship with food as puzzle pieces because I think there's all these little puzzle pieces within our relationship with food that sometimes are deeply intertwined and sometimes we can look at them separately. And so all those puzzle pieces are things that I'm going to start assessing with my clients. Things like how is our consistent nourishment going, right? Are we consistently and adequately nourishing our body? What is our internal talk, our voice around food? What does that sound like? Is there diet mindset or diet mentality present? Do we have an internal sense of permission to eat? Are we experiencing guilt and shame around food? What are our feelings like around food? What are our hunger cues like? Do we have strong hunger cues? What are our fullness cues like? How do we respond to them? What is our relationship to our body like? How do we talk about it? How do we treat our body? And then, of course, beliefs about food, right? We're taught all this stuff from diet culture, like this thing is bad or this thing is better. Don't eat this or don't eat that. So I want to start to see what are those beliefs about food. Um, Pleasure and satisfaction, emotional relationship to health. Like there's so many things. And this is why I love the intuitive eating framework because they outlined the puzzle pieces within our relationship with food, which is if you know the intuitive eating framework, what you just heard me say is the puzzle pieces, the principles from the IE framework. So I think that's also a really helpful tool to get a picture of what's going on with the client.
That is so helpful. And I really kind of want to take that clip and then like overlay something that says, quote unquote, just have more control around food. Because I feel like people have such a skewed perception of like, just don't eat so much or just stop when you're
Mhm.
full. And everything that you just described, it's a whole puzzle. And like one piece being out means puzzle not complete, right? One piece can be in the wrong place. Sometimes you have to try it. So I love the way that you just kind of described that. And it makes me think too of some mechanisms that I really love the perspective when I heard it one time of when people struggle with binging, they often want more of something. When they struggle with restriction, they often want less. What I found to be really interesting is when I almost phrase that to people and just see their reaction, 9 times out of 10, somebody's like, I do really want some more connection right now. I actually would like
Mhm.
some more intimacy. And instead of being able to get our needs met and more of something, we're like, I'll just have more food. Right. And I think that all that you just described is like, this is absolutely a puzzle. And, um, it takes so much intention to this is not just like, what am I physically putting into my body? There's so much of the why, there's so much of the messaging I heard 30 years ago. So I really appreciate you bringing up, especially the intuitive eating framework, because so much more is behind all of this.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
with assessment tools, obviously our clinical intuition is an incredible metric, but there's also standardized measurements that we can utilize. However, a lot of standardized measurements are not based off of binge eating, and they don't adequately assess binge eating. The EAT-26 is a fantastic assessment tool, but not so great for binge eating. So if you're coming into services and needing a thorough assessment, we want to make sure that we're actually giving scales that'll measure what we're looking for. I think the binge eating scale might be one of the only or best assessment tool for binge eating.
Yeah. Yeah. I also find it really helpful. We love to collaborate with our therapists, right? And therapists, so you guys, I don't know if your listeners know this, but dietitians don't diagnose eating disorders. That's not within our scope of practice. And so we love to really work with our therapists and have them doing a lot of that assessing and being able to really make sure we get the diagnosis when that's necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. And you bring up kind of the collaboration of care and the treatment team mechanism here. So, can you explain better the like nutritional counseling role and how that intertwines with medical therapy, psychiatry, things of that nature?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So I think that just like the puzzle piece with the relationship with food, right? The treatment team is also kind of a puzzle where we do need all the pieces of the puzzle because our physician is going to monitor the medical stuff. A therapist is obviously supporting, helping navigate, and bringing the client through the emotional journey and emotional healing. I think there's a big misconception about the dietitian role. A lot of clients will come to us, and I get this question of like, well, what is it going to be like? Or are you just going to tell me what to eat, right? Are you just going to kind of like give me a meal plan, tell me what to eat, and you're out the door? And that is not the role of the dietitian for, especially for eating disorder work, right? I often tell people it's going to feel a little bit more like therapy than you're probably expecting because it is counseling. The focus is on food, it is on body, it is on our relationship to food. But we are really there to guide the client in shifting their relationship with food. We do look at the actual nourishment, right? We do look at the food itself. Sometimes meal plans are appropriate, sometimes they're not. Sometimes there is menu planning, grocery shopping planning, like all of those typical things that we think of. But there is also really looking at how do our emotions impact how our eating behavior is happening right now in this moment. So it really, there's so many little threads and aspects to it. Yeah.
I really appreciate how in the nitty-gritty you get with these conversations, going into as detailed, okay, what does grocery shopping look like? And this is particularly important because I think in arguably the most shamed experiences, which might be binge eating and suicide, there's this concept that if we talk about it, it'll get worse. So, how do you approach the shame associated with binge eating, um, while also talking about meals and food rules and the complexities of this pathology or this experience?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this question actually makes me think a lot about body image work, right? Because when we think about body image work, it's kind of a similar feeling of like, well, if I focus on my body or I really dive into this, then I might experience more body image distress, right? And so I do see like there's two initial approaches with body image. It's the same thing with exploring food, right? Sometimes in the beginning, it can feel triggering. It can feel like it's bringing a lot of that deep under the surface stuff to the surface to focus on it, right? So sometimes we do need to shift our attention away. I'm going to use body image as the example here, right? Sometimes it's helpful when we're first starting our body image journey to cover up mirrors or, avoid facing it, right? But at some point, we want to shift. We want to dive in. We want to face it. We want to bring what's under the surface to the surface, really unpack it, start to explore it. This is where the healing is going to happen, right? And it's the same thing with food. Sometimes it can feel like, ooh, I'm nervous to really look at what's there because I'm afraid it's going to unravel and the behaviors. Excuse my cat, he always loves to join.
No,
Um,
we need a name. We need your cat's name, everything about
okay,
yeah.
yes.
Yep.
Ben, his name is, he just jumped up on the window, but his name is Benjamin Buttons. I name like this is so funny because when Taylor Swift, love Taylor Swift. When she named her cat Benjamin Buttons, I was like, you stole my cat's name.
Taylor, how dare you?
I know.
We'll
Yeah,
tag
so
her.
funny. I know, right? I hope she hears this. No, I'm just kidding. Um, yeah, so with the food piece, right? I think there can be fear. We want to support ourselves with that. And we want, we do want that magic to happen, right? We do want to start to pull what's under the surface and start to look at it. And sometimes that does bring things that are uncomfortable up, right? Or hard. But it's worth it. I 100% believe it's worth it because that is where a lot of the shifts and transformations are going to start to happen.
I think that that concept of if I talk about it, will it make it worse is such a valid fear, but it has been so debunked in so many different ways. And I think one of the biggest things that we can acknowledge, though, is that this is going to be a process. And I think that's kind of what you're identifying is that we have to go through different phases here. initially, once we understand the gravity of what's going on, maybe the emotions that we've been pressing down, initially it actually might feel worse. So that statement's got a little bit of truth to it, right? If I talk about this, am I going to feel worse? My answer is probably for a little bit, maybe for a little bit. But that worse allows us to figure out what's going on so that we can get to improvement. So it kind of reminds me of like the caterpillar turning into a butterfly and it has to kind of like writhe in the cocoon. And it's like really tough to watch. And we're all like, oh, why is it doing that? But it has to go through a little bit of that struggle to get out to the other side. And I think that's when people, specifically loved ones, seem to really be worried about that too. Like, if I bring this up to them, am I going to make this worse? And I'm like, it might be a tough conversation and you guys might learn a lot from it. So I think acknowledging that these are not like very quick solution, focus brief, therapeutic things that we overcome, it's going to take some time. And initially, that first phase might not be as fun and it might even feel worse than before you started.
I think really important to acknowledge about individuals who do have binge eating disorder is that 96 to 98% of the community also has pre-existing trauma or PTSD. So this community is an incredibly traumatized community. And the fact that they already have so much shame likely about their trauma, and then the shame on top of living with binge eating disorder, there's like no space for them to truly experience their pain and their wounds and their history without feeling like they need to be constricted, and talk about the metaphor of like constricting someone, and then here they are trying to break free of that, all while being shamed for trying to just nourish their body, and figure out a way to nourish their body. So what would you say are common triggers for binge eating disorder, and how can they be managed in the moment?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I feel like there's so many. I'm gonna go through some of the big ones that are popping into my head. The first one that really comes to mind here, I think is often kind of confused with binge eating, and this is what the intuitive eating framework calls primal hunger response. And so when we are really, really hungry, right? So we've gone maybe 6, 7, 8 hours without food. Eventually, our body will take over and force us to eat, right? There is no amount of like conscious thinking, willpower, or like talking ourselves out of it, right? Like this is a survival response, a survival mechanism that our body kicks in and is like, you will eat now. And if you found yourself ever just like, I'm just gravitating towards the kitchen and I'm grabbing this out of the cabinets and I'm grabbing this out of the cabinets and I don't even know how I got here, right? But you were hungry, it often looks like binging, but that's not really binging because it's primal hunger response. You're really hungry. But for someone that's struggling with binge eating disorder, when we are hungry, just even that can kind of trigger this experience of like, I'm binging now, right? There can be discomfort with even the feeling of hunger. There can be fear with the feeling of hunger for fear that it will trigger a binge because it's associated with this experience of primal hunger response. So that's one thing. And then, of course, our emotional experience, right? Like this is a big one. So if we are, one thing that really happens that I see happen with binge eating is the binge eating becomes the primary coping tool in a lot of ways for emotions, right? And so even if maybe it's a more subtle or not as intense emotional experience, binging steps in. Like it's the thing that's there because it's what we've gone so used to. It's the tool that's stepped in as always there for us, right? So sometimes when we think about like, okay, emotional triggers for binge eating, you would think like it's the big emotions, it's the hard emotions, it's going to be grief, it's going to be loneliness, it's going to be um betrayal or something like that. Sometimes it's just like I had a rough day and I want to take a load off, right? Or I'm just like a little down today, right? So with the emotional piece, there's a lot of triggers there, and we really want to work to start to identify and build awareness around what our emotional experience is like, the whole day leading up to binging, the moment binging is beginning to start, as we're binging, after we're binging, all of that stuff. Another big trigger that I see, I feel like I don't hear this one talked about so much, but it's really all about pleasure. And we all need pleasure from food. Pleasure is so important to get in our life, but also from food. It's like a basic, think of it as like a basic need. And so if we are always kind of eating food that we're not really that into, we don't really want to eat, right? We're never really going to have our pleasure needs fully met. So I actually like to talk about this like we have a pleasure threshold that we're always trying to meet our pleasure threshold. And if we haven't met our pleasure threshold, we're going to continue to seek pleasure. That's just normal and natural because we need that pleasure, right? And so sometimes if there's pleasure deprivation, the second there's pleasurable foods around, right? It can feel like gotta have that pleasure because we are desiring that pleasure threshold to get met right in the moment. So this can trigger a binge. And often this looks like um, feeling like you have specific binge foods, right? Or these foods, I always binge on these foods. Sometimes it's like, I just really love these foods, right? These foods are just really freaking delicious. And I don't let myself eat them a lot of the time. So there's like a deprivation around them. Um, Sometimes there are things that are blocking our pleasure, right? So like we're trying to we're trying to get pleasure. We feel like we're giving ourselves pleasure, but our pleasure is being blocked and our threshold isn't being met. So an example of this is I see a cupcake and I'm like, ooh, that cupcake looks really good. But then I'm like, maybe I shouldn't. And then I'm like, oh, but I really want it. And then I'm like, okay, fine, I'll have it. Great, I'm giving myself the pleasure. But the whole time I'm eating it, now I'm hearing this is going right to your thighs. Like, this is making you gain weight. You shouldn't be doing this, right? So, how much pleasure am I really receiving? And so, this can kind of compound, and there's that pleasure deprivation piece that stacks up over time. The other big trigger that I think is often overlooked is restriction voice, diet mindset, that little voice in our head that's telling us no, 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 which, kind of speaks to the pleasure piece we were just talking about. But even just that voice being present, the mental restriction being present can be enough to trigger a binge. If we're hearing that all day, that's emotionally exhausting, right? We not only do we now need to cope with that emotionally, but also it leads to this kind of like bow and arrow effect that we see where it's like, don't eat it, don't eat it, don't eat it. Bow and arrow is being pulled back, whoosh, bow and arrow flies, and we're like, must have it. And oftentimes this is not a choice, right? It doesn't feel like anybody's going in and they're like, let me binge right now. Sometimes binging is pre-planned, right? Binge eating disorder, not a choice. Oftentimes this is happening totally unconsciously and we don't even realize it.
I love that you bring up, that idea of like the mental matters. So just because you quote unquote allowed yourself to have it to not be restrictive, if you were using a restrictive mindset, it's still how your body perceived it and actually will still have a high propensity to cause a trigger. When you were discussing like the primal hunger, it made me think of this example that I give to a lot of people. And usually when I first start talking about it, they're like, what is this woman saying? So I hope you guys can give me some grace while it starts. But I have a question for both of you guys. What do you guys do each morning? Do we typically have a morning pee?
Yeah,
Okay. So
For
what
sure.
would happen if I said tomorrow morning I'd like you to cut it off halfway? What would you think about for maybe the next 6 hours? I didn't finish peeing, maybe.
yeah,
That'd
I
be
didn't finish
pretty
peeing.
uncomfortable.
yeah,
Yeah. So then I say green light, you can go ahead. Are you gonna like saunter into the restroom and be like, ah, right? No, you're gonna be like bulldozing the door, right? So it's kind of the same idea with binging too. If the body's like, I really would like some carbs, and you're like, oh, here's some protein, and you're like, I really would like some carbs, and it's like, oh, here's some fats. I really would like some carbs. Here's some water. By the time you actually can access the carbs, are you going to be like, oh, I'll just have a little bit? No, you're going to be like, give it all. And I think that that's that idea of, yes, the bow and arrow is a really good image of that, of just our body is going to demand to be heard. And it reminds me of something another guest said in our podcast of if you listen to your body when it whispers, you won't have to hear it when it screams. And I think it was Jane
Ooh,
Reagan that said that,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
Zoe? And when she said that, I was like, oh, this really pertains to like the binging situation as well, because the body's whispering, like, I'd like this need met. I'd really love this pleasure. And unfortunately, it gets to a point that it might have to scream, and that scream can lead to that binge.
The
Totally.
bow and arrow and the pea analogy is fantastic. I will be stealing that and using it on Monday. My trauma therapist brain is coming in though of what if they don't even know they have to pee? So if you have a comorbidity of trauma, which we know is prevalent in binge eating disorder, and you have extreme dissociation, which is also at significantly higher rates, you might not have access to your like internal experiential cues of hunger states, fullness states. And I've seen that a lot of people, exactly what Hannah was saying, is they'll be in the middle of a binge, be like, how did I get here? And that is because they're experiencing significant dissociation. And then on the contrary, I've seen individuals use binge eating as a way to increase their experiential presence through experiencing pain when they're binging and the physical experience of fullness to that excessive amount that that term that you had used. So there's this dichotomy between being absent and then binging, maybe even bringing them forward into the experience again. That's
Yeah.
my trauma rant for today.
No, I love it. You can run it back again. I think it's awesome. And it's such a good point, especially with that statistic that you bring up of so many people being able to relate to, unfortunately, that trauma history. It's such an impactful, like historical risk factor for moving forward and why the dynamic of binging is present. So if we're looking at things that have happened in the past for somebody, like a trauma or something like that, I'm interested, Hannah, can you share a little bit more about like a dieting history and how that might impact somebody's future or current pathology of binge eating?
Yeah, totally. Okay. So I think there's a couple of different pieces here that come to mind, right? Of course, there is a lot of unlearning when we're used to dieting, when we've been dieting, right? There's so much that we learn from that. If, maybe I have a client that comes in and their mom put them on Weight Watchers when they were a kid, right? There might be some unlearning around some of the beliefs that Weight Watchers instilled for them around food, like food has to be earned and is, you know, a point, or I need to make up for eating this, things like that. So really looking at like how does that diet history impact our beliefs, our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors around food, and what do we need to really shift around those things. But then I also think that like even speaking to this trauma piece, right? There's these experiences around dieting that are really hard, right? Where there can be memories that are attached to certain foods. There can be emotions that we're used to feeling that are attached to certain foods. And these are things that we want to look at and support our clients through as well.
Yeah, this is making me think of weight stigma and the idea that weight stigma is the last societally acceptable form of discrimination. And if we are conceptualizing discrimination as a little t trauma or even a big T trauma, the concept of weight stigma itself, if an individual is at a higher body weight and engaging in binge eating, is a form of trauma in and of itself. So how would you think that weight stigma does impact like recovery?
Yeah, yeah. Like if I could just scream like so much, it is so strong. It is such a big issue. It drives all of it, right? If there's one thing that we need to dismantle, to stop eating disorders, it's weight stigma, right? And so it so deeply impacts, our beliefs about ourselves, our beliefs about the world. It deeply impacts our feelings about ourselves, about food, all the things, right? And so it's really difficult. It's something that, I want for everybody, but it is difficult to separate ourselves from a society that's deeply entrenched in these belief systems that big bodies are bad and small bodies are good. And that's so often a part of the healing process. And part of the reason why this isn't always so easy, right? Because we are working towards separating ourselves, unlearning some of those beliefs, understanding that they really are external. They really don't have to come from us. They come from society. And then there's how do we support ourselves, knowing that we might encounter some of these things with our family, with our friends, in conversations, on TV and media, at the doctor's office. So I feel like it's a journey of really trying to separate ourselves from weight stigma, unlearn some of those belief systems, and then support ourselves through knowing that moment to moment we might encounter weight stigma again.
I love that you're
Yeah.
using terms like we and our because it shows it's just like not a problem for just our clients. This is something that clinicians are like we are in this society as well, meaning it's really, really important for clinicians and providers to look within and acknowledge their own weight stigma, acknowledge the language that they have heard, some biases that might be kind of hidden. It's so important for clinicians to acknowledge, oh, we live in the same society that they do. We might not have the same experiences, but we've certainly got the same societal pressures. But it also makes me think of like loved ones, partners, family members. They also exist in this weight stigma full, filled society, yet they're also the ones that are really trying to help their loved ones. And I think that's a really tough thing for people to navigate because they're like, wait, I've been getting this stimulus, but I don't react the way that they do. What is some advice that you have for loved ones or partners trying to support somebody struggling with binge eating disorder without enabling or shaming?
Yeah, yeah. I see this so much because it is so hard, right? Because a lot of times, family members, maybe it's mom or dad, maybe it's siblings, right? They have the best intentions. They do want to help, but they've, like you said, have also received all of this messaging from diet culture. And there are misconceptions around what what it looks like to treat binge eating disorder or what's going to be helpful for someone who's experiencing binging or maybe just even experiencing struggles in their relationship with food. And so often people will look at it like, oh, they're struggling with eating too much. I should just tell them to eat less. Or maybe you shouldn't have quite that. Or maybe we could put this away. Or maybe we shouldn't buy this or keep it in the house, right? And all of those things are just reinforcing all of the underlying issues that are driving the eating disorder in the first place, right? So I think education on this, getting families to understand like how this works, like restriction contributes, restriction, mental restriction, physical restriction, guilt and shame around food drives the binge eating behaviors that pop up, right? And so I love to talk about shifting the way we're talking about food in general, right? So we want to never place shame or judgment on food. We want to really neutralize our food talk, right? All food is just, it's food. Gets to be great, right? And so if we talk about it in this way, it helps really normalize and create more safety for someone who's navigating binge eating disorder. And we want to do this with bodies as well, right? Bodies often are intertwined. Our relationship, how we're thinking about them, what they mean to us around bodies, that's often intertwined with our relationship with food. So we also want to neutralize body talk, um, avoid talking about bodies and like a, this one's good, this one's bad, this one's better, this one's worse. They're all just like food. They're all great, right? Yeah.
You bring up the like incorporation of family support and uh, this being a team effort. So if there is one thing that you could say to clients or families or even clinicians about binge eating disorder, what would your tagline be?
If there was one thing that I could say about binge eating disorder, yeah. Um, it's not what you think it is.
Ooh, I love that. Okay. Any last comments from all of us before we wrap up?
I think of if you are listening to this and you're like, oh, could this be me? I really, really hope that you take this as a moment that you can go in and get help and not be shamed. And there are people out there that want to help you and know how to help you. Um, people, when they come in specifically with this presentation, are like, why can't I just get it together around food? And I say, it's not about the food. If it was, I wouldn't have a job. And again, I'd be very happy for society, but please know that you are not alone. You and so much of society struggles in this manner with their relationship with food. And I just hope that you feel a little bit of that shame lift today to be able to help yourself if you're making that decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is not about control or discipline or willpower. Binge eating is a clinically significant mental health concern that deserves support from a whole treatment team like all three of us.
Yeah, yeah. I always love to tell people also, sometimes this does feel hopeless, right? It feels like these things can't be can't be shifted or changed. And these are like these belief systems can be unlearned. We can shift these things if you want to, right? And there are people out there that can support you with that. And sometimes I think it's really about finding the right people for you that are gonna have that safety and support you in the way that you need.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is On the Mic with Ed. Wherever you are, whoever you are, take a seat with us.